Hi, everybody, and welcome to this special episode of the Dr. Keith Darrow Podcast, where today we welcome someone very special, an icon in the field of hearing healthcare, Dr. Barbara Weinstein. Barbara, thank you so much for agreeing to be on here, and thank you for the decades of work that you have put into advancing the field of hearing healthcare.
My pleasure. It's a passion. It's a passion of mine since I was admitted to graduate school, ironically, for both audiology and speech pathology. And I was going to start in speech pathology at Columbia, my master's, and then I got a phone call from a professor at Case Western. They had a fellowship for me in audiology. So boom, I went right to Cleveland and went to audiology.
Wow. I got to say, I feel like half the audiologists you bump into have certainly not the same details as that story, but they have a similar. I was thinking about speech pathology and then realized I can't spend my life, down on my hands and knees playing with little kids. It's just not for me. At least that was my route. My mother said, look at speech pathology. I did, but I instantly got attracted to audiology.
So when I applied for a doctoral program, which was also serendipity, Dr. Ventry interviewed me, and among other people, and speech pathologists were at the interview, and they said, well, why do you want to go into audiology? Why do you want to get a PhD in audiology and not speech pathology? I said, well, because I'm not creative enough to do speech pathology. So that's why I decided on audiology. They said, you have to be creative to be an audiologist. So that was a nail in my coffin. But I got in anyway.
I basically, I think you'll appreciate this. My intro to audiology class for my undergrad students at the university, I essentially lay it out there as each patient is a puzzle, and you've got to figure out all the pieces. And here are all the tools you have. Now, unfortunately, and we don't have to go down that rabbit hole, but unfortunately, I don't think enough audiologists use all the tools that they have. But that's basically how I set up the class of you are an investigator and you have to figure out where the hearing loss is coming from, how it's impacting their life. Because look, if a patient walks in and says, I think I have hearing loss, and 2 hours later, they walk out of your office, the only thing they know is, oh yeah, I have a hearing loss. Did you actually do anything? Right? I mean, they already knew that.
So that's interesting because that's how I approach each patient. I approach each patient as a single subject design. So everybody is a single subject and it's a research project, and I'm going to uncover everything I can when I approach each patient. And that's how I approach each patient. And that's how I teach my students to approach each patient. They don't necessarily listen, but I do.
I love that. Now I have to ask, I do hear a little bit of an accent there. So where are you from? Where are your humble beginnings?
My humble beginnings are from a place called Long Island in New York State. So, but I don't feel I grew up there. I lived there until I went off to college, but I feel I grew up when I returned to New York City for my PhD in Columbia and never left. So that's where I grew up.
Gotcha. Yeah, I kind of figured that. I'm a Staten Island kid, born and raised.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I feel the same way, right? At this point, with all this gray, I have officially been in Massachusetts more than I was in New York, but I'm sure you know the saying, you can take us out of New York, but you can't take the New York out of us.
That's for sure.
So I had a feeling you were going to say Long Island or Queens. I wasn't sure which one. So I have to ask you, because I know most people in this field, I feel like it's hard to write a paper about the impact of hearing loss and not reference the work of Dr. Barbara Weinstein, who looked specifically at social isolation and hearing loss in the elderly. And
that's amazing. You knew that. That's amazing that you knew. I'm glad you know that. I'm glad you knew that.
Of course I do. Look, I know my patients don't necessarily read it, but I talk to them. I've offered them the article. I have used it in reference in the books I've written, in any publications to patients. I believe isolation is really one of the biggest issues that our patients are dealing with. And then it's that isolation that can lead to a host of other problems like decline and falling and everything else. But I think a lot of it really starts with isolation. So bring us back in time, because I think we got to be close to what, the 40th anniversary?
Yeah, I mean,
Right?
I did my dissertation in 1980 on hearing loss and social isolation. So, but in those days, what's interesting about first of all, I took a class in sociology of aging when I was a doctoral student in Columbia. And the woman who taught the class was a very well-known sociologist. And she talked about measuring isolation and loneliness. And I said, wow, you can measure isolation and loneliness. There must be a link between hearing loss and isolation. And then in learning about isolation, it turns out that in those days, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, disengagement was the normal, natural course of aging process. So it's called the disengagement theory. And they said it's natural for old people to disengage. So I said, well, that sounds interesting. Let me look into the literature. So all the studies on disengagement, which was the prevailing theory, nobody ever looked at hearing loss as a contributor to disengagement, and it was considered to be normal. No downsides to disengagement. So I told my mentor, Dr. Ventry, I said, I'm going to do a thesis, my dissertation on hearing loss, social isolation, and loneliness. And he said, Barbara, I don't think so. That's not really relevant. It's not really that important. And it's going to be really hard to do because there's going to be too many variables that you're not going to be able to control. I said, I'm going to go for it. And I said, I'm going to control everything statistically, and I'm going to do it. So that's what I did. But, so my dissertation was on hearing loss and isolation and loneliness. And I knew that there were all these different audiometric variables that could relate. So that's why I measured pure tone hearing, but I didn't think that was going to be enough in those days. So I had to measure self-reported handicap, and I used the hearing measurement scale. And then I had to do some sort of central auditory test to capture auditory processing, but in those days you didn't really have that many. So I did the rush use, which most people wouldn't hear of. And then I did word recognition W22s, and lo and behold, still holds out to today. The single strongest predictor of isolation and loneliness is self-reported hearing difficulties, not the pure tone audiogram. It's self-reported hearing difficulty. So, but I
think we all can agree, with all due respect to the audiogram, but in some respects, it's a piece of crap. Excuse my language.
Well, so I've been talking about that since 1980.
Good.
And when I developed the Hearing Handicap Inventory after I did my dissertation with Dr. Ventry, I wrote about that. There's so much variability, unexplained variability in so many different measures and the connections between pure tones and hearing handicap and word recognition and handicap. There's all these other variables that count. So the pure tone audiogram contributes so little. But most people didn't listen. And finally,
I think two things. Most people didn't listen. And without, creating too much controversy here, I think enough people didn't listen. And the big five, the people, making the hearing aids and looking to make sure that they get sold, convinced everybody in our field that you just need pure tones to fit a hearing aid. Right. And so the rest of the stuff doesn't matter. Why bother to even investigate more? Do the pure tones fit the hearing aid and help the patient?
Right. Yeah. And so, when I created the Hearing Handicap Inventory, I said to Dr. Ventry, I said, I want to create a hearing handicap. when I finished my PhD, he asked me to join the faculty at Columbia, and we were walking to the cafeteria, and I said, you know what? I think I want to create a hearing handicap inventory. And he said, Barbara, how are you going to do that? I said, I'll figure it out. So we did it. We worked on it. He offered a course to doctoral students, and we all worked together on helping to develop it and test it out. And then we walk into the cafeteria again. I said, you know what? I think we need a screening version, because I was into screening at the time. So he said, how are you going to do that? I said, it's okay, I'll do it. So I went to the computer, and that was it. So I developed the Hearing Handicap Inventory and the screening guidelines, kind of simultaneously. But then again, a lot of people didn't listen. So then I decided, well, you know what? I was working at the VA. I said, I think that there's a connection between dementia and hearing loss. So then I did my study on dementia and hearing loss, which nobody was interested in either.
So tell me more about that study, how you went from loneliness. And by the way, actually, before we get into the dementia bit, I really do want to comment, because I don't think even I realized that there was actually a name for it. What'd you say? Disengagement?
Disengagement.
Right?
Disengagement.
Because I think about, and I make reference to this a lot, I just didn't realize it was a name. I make reference to my grandmother or some of my great aunts who have now passed, and but they were in their 70s, late 60s, 70s. And the vision I have of them was never leaving the house, in their house dress, and just not being very active. Now, my 70-something-year-old mother has a more active social life than I do. Like, she's out all the time, dinners, events, movies. I mean, you name it, she goes on vacation. It's so different then versus now. And I would imagine that factor of isolation and treating hearing loss has to be even more important now because we care about the last 20 years of our life more than we ever used to.
Yeah, well, it's just, I'd say that it's within the past 10 years that there's been all these studies on isolation and loneliness, two different criteria, two different variables. But we now know the downstream effects of isolation in terms of leading to cognitive decline. And we didn't realize how significant social isolation and loneliness were. And it's the biggest contributor to longevity is being engaged. So, but what's interesting in this, according to the data in literature on sociology of aging in the 70s, 60s, there were two major theories: either people disengaged or they remained active. So there was the activity theory and the disengagement theory won out. So
now everybody's being active. And I love what you just said, because that ties in. And I know you have to be more familiar with the papers than even I am. The studies looking at the centurions, right? Those small populations, those pockets, I want to say it's in Italy, where there's the most people over 100 per capita. And everybody thinks it must be their genes, it must be their diet, it must be XYZ. No, it actually boils down to their social engagement as being the biggest factor for why they live so long. And I just don't think our society puts enough emphasis on it.
Yeah, well, there was this one podcast on social isolation and loneliness where the person who did the podcast actually went to Sardinia or someplace in Europe, and she did study these people, and that's what she found. They were engaged, and it wasn't the sardines. It was the fact that they had relations, and it's not the number of relationships; it's really the quality of the relationship.
Quality, yes. Oh God, I'm so glad you clarified that, because I don't want people listening to think, "Oh, I need more social media friends in order to live longer," because that's not what was said at all.
So when we do an intake with our patients, it's important that we ask about the quantity of the relationships, but it's more because that's going to get at isolation. We have to ask about the quality, because that's going to get at loneliness. Are they satisfied with the nature of the engagement? And the hearing and processing and cognitive issues do interfere with that, the quality of the relationships.
I love your outlook on how important hearing is to overall quality of life. I wish every, dare I say, MD geriatric specialist shared your passion. I think we would have a different world if we put more of a focus on this one simple thing. Treating hearing loss has so much, has really got legs and really can help to transform your patients' lives, as compared to, you're getting older, you don't hear so well, not a big deal, which is the general consensus on hearing loss.
Well, it's interesting. I had I'm very, very interested in, I want one of my legacies to be the involvement of doctors, primary care doctors, in identifying and screening for hearing difficulty, not necessarily hearing loss. So I developed a grant, and I said to one of my friends who's a psychiatrist, I said, I want to test this out. And what do you think of this approach this was about 10 years ago, this approach to screening for hearing loss? He said, Barbara, why would I refer anybody for a hearing test when hearing aids don't work? This was 10 years ago. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. He's a psychiatrist, a smart guy. And I said, that's interesting. Okay, fast forward 4 years ago. He said, Barbara, I have to ask you a question. I heard that there might be an increased risk of dementia with hearing loss. What do you think about that? Then I told him, and I said, I think I'm getting hearing aids. So he got hearing aids, and he loves the hearing aids. But it was really, and now the team of medical doctors I work with at NYU Langone Hospital in New York, we're part of a team, public health specialists, geriatricians, the head of geriatrics. And in fact, he runs the dementia clinic, and every single one of his patients now, all the fellows, they administer hearing tests and they administer self-report. And now we've been doing a lot of some studies in the VA hospital, the emergency department, screening hearing loss and giving people pocket talkers. So this guy is really, really invested, and it's a really wonderful thing to be part of that team with the doctors influencing doctors, which is what's so important.
Yeah, which is great. Even though you said the word pocket talker, I still think it's great. I have to say, somebody actually,
I should call it a personal amplifier.
No, I know. I actually have to say, a colleague of mine was just telling me recently about a patient, and I really haven't heard these two words in probably 20 years. A patient was in her office demanding that she help her, the audiologist, help her get another body aid. She's been using body aids her whole life, and that's all she wants. And like, I think, my colleague had to like go through catalogs and figure out how to get one. So, wow. Yeah. All right. So let me ask you, so how do you go from, okay, we've got loneliness, we have isolation. How does that theory start to develop into playing a role in cognitive decline, really before it became popularized in hearing healthcare?
Yeah, well, I mean, basically, there have been in the geriatrics literature, Holt and Lundstad, among others, they began to show the downstream effects of loneliness and isolation. And they also, they realized, they saw that they looked at risk of dementia with loneliness and isolation, and they did see that it increases the risk. And there was one interesting study where the number of activities people were engaged in was predictive of onset of dementia. And people with fewer than 6 activities had an increased likelihood of dementia. And when I was working in the nursing homes, I would sit around and I'd see all this was in the 80s, early 80s, and I would walk around and there were all these people sitting in their wheelchairs, just looking down, and nobody would talk to them. They were condemned as this is you're just waiting to die because you all have dementia. You all have, and I had a couple of patients, and you couldn't get through to them. And basically, I used some sort of a personal amplifier. In those days, you didn't have pocket talkers, whatever. Actually, when I was at the audiometer, I did speech testing. I spoke through the headphone. And basically, what I saw was these people kind of it took a while for them to get used to sound. And it took a while for them to react to sound. And then what happened is I worked with a few of them, and they ended up like waking up. And it's kind of like their brain woke up. And I would keep the personal amplifier on them, and I would have them sitting outside. And I say to them, and nurses would just pass them by, and I said, say hello to the person. And because they never even said hello, and they said hello to the person, and the person responded. So you could see that there is there's mislabeling and misidentifying people with significant hearing loss as possibly having dementia. So that was, for me, that was the first time I saw it. And then what I did is at the time, I didn't think about the link between isolation and dementia, but these people were totally isolated and lonely and left out. But then I was at the Veterans Hospital in St. Albans, Queens, and I said to one of my colleagues, I said, I think we should do the mental status questionnaire. That was a test that in those days, it's what they used for assessing screening for dementia. Let's just take a group of people who are diagnosed with dementia. Let's just administer this mental status test with and without hearing aid, without a personal amplifier. They were all in this long-term care facility. And let's see if the scores change if they can hear the questions. It was just a very simple theory. So it turned out that these are all people identified with diagnosed with dementia. And it was fascinating to see how the relationship between the score on the MSQ and the hearing level was significant when they couldn't hear the questions. And then when you took away hearing and they could hear the questions, there was no relationship. And then we categorized people into severity of dementia. And then you saw that people you were able to lower the severity of the dementia. So that was my first that was my first trip into this whole dementia world. But again, nobody cared because nobody.
All right. So I want to stop you there for a second. So when was this paper published approximately?
1985.
What's the problem? Like your paper came out, let me see, we do a quick math here, 10, 20, about 25 years before the Frank Lynn study, which is the one that everybody refers to off the top of their head. Frank Lynn's been in front of Congress, right? I mean, he's riding the wave, which is great. He's done great work. But what happened? What's with that 25-year delay? I mean, it's almost sad and upsetting to think of what could have been had we taken this data more seriously. Why did that happen?
Well, if you think about the trajectory of audiology, so in the 70s, we were not dispensing hearing aids. We were interested in admittance. That was the big thing. Shlomo's thing. That was I
was in Shlomo's classes. I know.
Yeah, and you go to the all the ASHA meetings, because in those days you didn't have the AAA, and all the rooms were full with the mittens. And then in the 80s, when we started dispensing hearing aids, all the hearing aid rooms were full with the people interested in hearing technology. And then when you ended up with ABR, that was in the 90s, everybody was interested in the technology. So everybody was interested in the technology, in my opinion, and they weren't interested in the patient. And I still think that that's a problem. And what's interesting in following the hearing handicap date literature, a lot of the people who were into word recognition testing, Marilyn Demarest, Brian Walden, they were all into word recognition testing. Judy Dubno, Larry Humes, they were all into word recognition, speech and noise. And then all of a sudden they all got into, hey, this self-report stuff, there's something to it. Marilyn Demarest, Walden, they developed the self-report. And now you have Larry Humes, who's like, to me, he's the most well-respected audiologist ever. And he's basically, Dr. Hearing Aids, Dr. Speech Testing, and Judy Dubno. I mean, he's going out saying that the self-report is where it's at now in terms of wellness, in terms of auditory wellness. So I think basically audiologists have been focused on technology. A lot of the people who have gone into audiology, when I teach my speech, when I used to teach undergraduate courses in audiology, 2 people would switch over to audiology, and everybody else would go into speech. And basically because they felt that audiology was much more technical and they could hide behind the audiometer. But now speech pathology is pretty technical as well. And audiology is got to be a person-centered profession, and audiologists are still stuck on the technology. So like when we've interviewed students to come into our program, they say that they want to work with people with cochlear implants. They really want to help people hear better. And then when they graduate, they say they want to work with hearing aids. I said, you want to work with people. The hearing aid is an assist, and they really, it's the technology. And I have to say, you said it before, the manufacturers are the ones who are going to drive this focus on the patient, because you talk until you're blue in the face. And this auditory wellness thing, I think, is an important.
It absolutely is. And I do appreciate your hindsight view there. And I think it actually makes sense, because when I came out of grad school, which was in 2000, right? That's when I finished at Brooklyn College. I walked out, I said, I genuinely feel I am a great diagnostician. You give me that puzzle, I can piece it together. But now what? Right? I feel you're right. I feel like I was coming at the end of the ABR. I remember Shlomo Silman's classes on vestibular. Like there was so much we could do to diagnose, but at the time there wasn't enough focus on treatment. And dare I say, right, in 2000, maybe we'd just agree that hearing aids were crap and really only helped about 70% of people, and they got a bad name for a good reason at times. And so now I feel like we are at a great point where we've got not only the ability to be a great diagnostician, but a great therapist, a great person to be able to help people hear their best, live their best life, avoid the pitfalls of decline and falling and isolation. And so I feel like it's starting to finally come together.
But what's interesting is that we're slow. We're just so slow to change. So Mo Bergman, you heard of Mo Bergman, right?
Yeah.
So he was actually on the faculty at Hunter, I think, not at Brooklyn College, but he was celebrating his 90th birthday. He was on the faculty at the Graduate Center too, and they decided to honor him. So they asked me to do a speech honoring him. I didn't really know him. I just read his articles, and I went back to the literature because he started in the field in the 50s. And I went back to the literature, and I looked at the number of people who had hearing loss and the number of people who were using hearing aids. This was done. So I looked at the 1950, 20% or 25% of people with hearing loss were using hearing aids. Fast forward to now, it's the same percentage. So,
Yep.
And hearing aids, the technology has gone so sophisticated. So there is something up here in that the proportions have not changed. And you have this technology which is so sophisticated now. So it's got to be, there's a missing variable, and that's the focus on the patient.
So that brings me to my next question, which is the future of hearing healthcare. And as we sit here today, even though this will be released on a later date, as we sit here today, the supposed final thoughts and regulations on over-the-counter hearing aids came out this morning. I did not get a chance to read them, but I got the post about it. So what do you see in the next 5 to 10 years? Are you pro or against, or what are your thoughts on it with all your experience?
Well, so what's interesting is, I'm still focused on this, and I'm so disappointed because, I just glanced at these because I was looking for one thing, and I was looking for who are the candidates for these over-the-counter technology. And they still say it's people with mild to moderate hearing impairment, perceived mild to moderate hearing impairment. That's confusing. And they did not change that. I don't, and who is going to say that, who perceives a mild to moderate hearing impairment? You don't do that. I think that
right. Our patients typically, they wait 7 to 10 years. They come in, they're in a lot of pain.
Yeah, they absolutely wait. And they wait 7 to 10 years to get 8.9 years according to Judy Dubnow's work. And then the same thing with cochlear implants. Then they also wait about that same length of time for cochlear implants. And I think the over-the-counter is important. I think we're going to reach more people. But there are going to be downsides for a lot of older people who are not going to be able to manage the technology on their own, and they're going to come into the audiologist. And I don't want the audiologist to turn them away because they're not selling them a hearing aid. So I think the audiologists are going to have to start unbundling. The manufacturers are going to start I'm sure they have their devices already, the technology out there ready, the OTC hearing aids. And we're going to have to educate consumers. We have to educate primary care doctors about the technology and who it's for, who the candidates. It's kind of like the same thing, like who's going to go to Costco for hearing aid versus who's going to come to an audiologist for hearing aids. And there are certain people who it's appropriate to go for an over-the-counter. Initially, I see them as glasses, as starter eyeglasses, like a lot of people,
Sure.
they're going to. Sure. So I think hopefully audiologists accept these people into their offices and work with them. We have a great future. But if the manufacturers and the audiologists don't start the unbundling and don't start welcoming, I think it's going to be problematic for our field. The drugstore, the drugstores are getting ready. I personally think like the CVS's, which is just like health clinics, this is the place we should be going there. We should be educating them about the value of audiology, why you're going to send some of your old patients to audiology. And we have a lot of education to do. And
we definitely do. I think the onus is on us. I think the onus has been on us. I think we took a back seat to the manufacturers, right, and the big pharma of hearing. And I think now, I think there was so many emotions and feelings of betrayal and what's going to happen. But at the end of the day, the spotlight is on us, and it's our opportunity to say, here's the value we provide. We've hidden behind the widget for way too long. If you just survey most of the audiology websites out there, front and center, widget, widget, widget. And so it's finally our turn to say, you know what? We are more than that. We provide deeper services. And look, if a patient wants to go to CVS and get their starter glasses, starter hearing aids, like that's okay. But ultimately, you do have a significant major medical condition, the number one sensory disorder on the planet that can lead to a host of other comorbid conditions. So just realize what you're doing and don't think, oh, I'm just going to go to CVS and get a hearing aid, because if that's the message, that's not good. And I do think all ships will rise the more we all talk about the benefits of hearing healthcare.
Well, I just think that audiologists, they have to document the value of the services. So I feel that, when they send a report to a doctor, they should say, this person got a hearing aid, and this person now, he's auditory wellness is this, so he's really able to communicate better. We have to communicate the benefit and the value of the technology that we're giving the patients. And I think that that's something we don't do. And we have a bad reputation, because patients are just going to complain the negative. They're not going to complain the positive. And I know I'm a very big advocate for cochlear implants for people who have considerable residual disability with their hearing aids and are isolating and are lonely. And audiologists don't assess residual disability and say, hey, look, rehab's not working, hearing aids, all the accessories, we need to take the next step, start talking about it. And I think that's, there are people whose lives have been changed when they end up taking that jump. And the audiologists, again, are not referring to that either, because they want it's short-sighted. It's just short-sighted.
Sure. So last question, because I've already taken enough of your time here. Last question. What do you see as the future of cognitive healthcare in audiology? I know, in full transparency, both you and I are on the Cognitive Audiology board. We believe in cognitive screenings. So what are your thoughts on that?
So I think that, so I did a lot of workshops in Australia a couple of years ago on cognitive screening. And there is a place totally for cognitive screening, but I think that we have to educate audiologists before we're going to have them embark on this screening, because first of all, you have to know how to kickstart that conversation, and why are you screening for this? And there's reasons in terms of speech understanding, there's reasons in terms of the connections with memory, there's reasons in terms of education about hearing aids, but we have to be able to kickstart the conversation. And then we have to feel comfortable talking about the results, and then making sure to refer and having resources and having referral networks. So I think it's an important thing. We should be doing it. We're going to help identify people early in the diagnostic stage, and then they can be part of the management. So because we see our patients over time, and if we can identify that there's been a change, it's really important for our patients, for people who are going to have to live with dementia for a long time. But I think we have to we can't just sell them, say screen, and then think that that's going to be part of the armamentarium.
No, definitely not. I agree wholeheartedly. I think that cognitive screening in any form, paper-based, subjective, objective, I think bringing that in does require us to be very educated, to know how to implement, to know how to integrate. Let's not just go buy the next new shiny tool in audiology. Like you said, in the 90s, it was ABR. This decade, it'll probably be cognitive screenings. But I think it's so important. And because it's so powerful, in the words of Stan Lee, with great power comes great responsibility. And I think that we have to embrace that responsibility, not just here's a screening, maybe you have dementia, maybe you don't, go talk to your doctor. It's got to be more than that.
The other thing I think we have to really be sensitive to is that, people will have hearing loss and it increases the risk for dementia, but there's symptoms of people who have dementia, cognitive impairment, and they're not processing what the information, but they don't have a hearing loss, but they do have a processing problem. So that connection between the processing And normal peripheral hearing is kind of important too, but the way in which you interact with somebody with a hearing loss and cognitive, or somebody with processing and cognitive and no hearing loss, we use the same communication strategies, and that's really kind of important. And in terms of dementia, and in terms of cognitive screening, it's incumbent on us to, make sure we know how to communicate this information and resources, and we have to really work with family members, because that's the burden on family members is important, and we have to become part of teams. We need to become the part of the team, and that's interprofessional relationships is really, really, really important. And there's a problem. We're kind of behind the eight ball on that as well. I sound pretty negative, but
no, I don't think so. What I hear the glass is half full. I think we are both in agreement that audiology has its best days ahead of it. And so I am honored to have had you on the podcast today. I am grateful for all the work that you have done and for everything that you have contributed. It has been an amazing career. Just reading your articles along the way has really helped me to embrace my, neuroscientist diagnostic side, and always remember it's patient first, and that we've got to consider the emotional well-being and the emotional status of our patients. So I thank you for that. And I believe a lot of people listening will feel the same way. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor to meet you and to work with you. And I look forward to working with you in the future.
Absolutely. Hey, one last question, though. I can't let you go without something personal. So you mentioned to me off air that you are up in the Berkshires, which is Western Massachusetts. So now I've got all these thoughts in my head. So I'll just ask, what's one of your favorite hobbies?
Tennis. And golf.
Tennis. Okay. Excellent.
I just finished playing tennis. And pickleball.
So, I was just gonna ask you, are you into pickleball? And if so, I think that may be our way to socially connect. I've been playing pickleball now for a few years. I'm not that good, but I have a lot of fun.
Yeah, tennis, pickleball, golf. That's my those are my favorite things to do.
I'm with you on all three of them. So at some point, I'll take that 2-hour ride out to the Berkshires, and we'll do one of those, if not all three.
We can meet in Amherst. We can go to the tennis courts at Amherst.
Perfect. Excellent. Thank you so much, and take care and have a great day.